Cold water crashes across the concrete floor. A man hangs from his wrists in a dark cell, breathing hard and shaking. Blood drips slowly from his fingertips. Outside the iron door, boots scrape against stone. Another interrogation is coming, another night without sleep, another hour inside a body that no longer feels human. The prisoner closes his eyes and suddenly he is standing beside a lake. The water is still. Morning fog drifts across the surface. Pine trees sway gently in the wind. A wooden cabin sits near the shoreline, smoke rising from the chimney, bread baking somewhere nearby. Warmth touches his face. For a moment, he forgets the chains cutting into his wrists. For a moment, the cabin feels more real than the prison. And that is the danger. Because in places where reality becomes unbearable, the human mind begins building new worlds to survive. Not metaphorical worlds. Real ones, with streets, routines, voices, people who never existed, entire lives constructed inside starving, tortured minds. This happened in prisoner camps during World War II, in isolation cells, inside labor camps buried beneath snow and ash. Men and women trapped so long in suffering that the brain did something extraordinary. It opened a door away from reality. And some never fully came back. Winter, 1943. Eastern Europe. The prison camp sat beyond miles of frozen forest. Barbed wire stretched endlessly through the snow. Watchtowers stared down like empty eyes. The prisoners called it the White Grave. Every morning began the same way. Whistles, dogs barking, men collapsing before sunrise. The guards counted bodies more carefully than names. Inside the barracks, disease moved through the air like smoke. Rotting wood, wet wool, unwashed skin. The smell never left. At night, prisoners lay packed together so tightly they could hear each other's teeth chattering. Nobody spoke much anymore. Speech required energy, hope required even more. Among them was a former schoolteacher named Elias Weber, 32 years old, thin enough to see every rib beneath his skin. Before the war, Elias taught literature in Vienna. He loved maps, poetry, long train rides through the countryside. Now, he carried stones across frozen mud for 14 hours a day, while guards beat prisoners who slowed down. At first, Elias survived the way everyone else did. Count the hours, follow orders, stay invisible. But the human mind can only absorb so much pain before it begins searching for exits. And eventually, Elias found one. It began with a room. Nothing elaborate, just a single room inside his imagination. He created it during interrogations. The guards forced him into a chair beneath a hanging lamp. Questions repeated endlessly. Names, locations, resistance contacts. Every answer brought another strike across the face. So, Elias started imagining wallpaper. Blue wallpaper, tiny cracks running through the corners. A bookshelf beside a window. Rain tapping softly against glass. He focused on details because details were stronger than pain. Every time the guard shouted, he added something new. A chair, a rug, a kettle warming over a stove. The room became a place he could visit. Soon, he stopped hearing the interrogator clearly. The words drifted farther away each night, like voices underwater. Then the room expanded. Elias began constructing an entire town inside his mind. Not consciously at first. It simply grew. A survival instinct disguised as imagination. And in a place built entirely from suffering, the imagined town became sacred. He named it Hallstatt, not the real Austrian village, a different one, his version. There were narrow cobblestone streets, lined with lanterns glowing gold at dusk. A bakery on the corner where fresh bread cooled near open windows. A clock tower rang every hour. Children ran through the snow wearing bright scarves. Nobody screamed there. Nobody disappeared there. Every night in the barracks, Elias returned to Hallstatt piece by piece. He memorized the town like scripture. The shape of every doorway, the sound of lake water against the docks, the exact pattern of sunlight moving across rooftops in the morning. While real prisoners coughed blood beside him, Elias walked through imaginary forests. While guards dragged corpses across frozen dirt, Elias sat inside imaginary cafes, drinking hot coffee from ceramic cups. Slowly, the two worlds began separating. Reality became distant. Hallstatt became home. One night, after 17 straight hours of labor, Elias collapsed in the snow. A guard kicked him hard across the ribs. "Get up." Another kick. But Elias barely felt it because he was no longer there. He was somewhere else entirely. Inside Hallstatt, church bells rang softly across the lake. Snow fell in slow silence. Warm candlelight flickered through cabin windows. Elias walked through the town square, wearing a heavy wool coat. He could feel its weight on his shoulders. He entered the bakery. Heat wrapped around him instantly. The smell nearly made him cry. Fresh bread, butter, cinnamon. A woman behind the counter smiled at him gently. He had created her months earlier. Anna. Dark hair tied behind her neck, soft green eyes. She always remembered his favorite pastry, always asked how his day had been, always listened. Longing and relief swirled together inside him. Outside the bakery windows, snow drifted peacefully through the orange streetlight. No guards, no screaming, no dogs, just warmth, just silence. For several minutes, Elias could not remember the camp at all, not the barracks, not the war, not even his own hunger. Then something strange happened. A distant sound echoed through Hallstatt. A scream, sharp and violent, cut through the town like lightning. The bakery flickered. Anna's face blurred. The walls trembled. And suddenly Elias was back in the snow. A guard was dragging him upright by the collar while another prisoner cried nearby after being beaten unconscious. Elias looked around in confusion. The transition felt wrong, like waking from one reality into another. For the first time, he realized something terrifying. He had started believing the imaginary world more than the real one. This was not simple daydreaming. It was psychological flight, the brain protecting itself by abandoning unbearable reality. Inside camps and torture cells, prisoners often described leaving mentally while their bodies remained behind. Some replayed old memories endlessly. Others built routines, imaginary conversations, entire alternate lives. Because pain without escape destroys the mind. But imagination offered distance, a tiny gap between suffering and awareness. The danger was that the gap could widen too far. And for Elias, it did. Weeks passed. Hallstatt expanded further. He added train tracks leading into the mountains, a library filled with books he once loved, a lakeside bench where he sat beside Anna every evening. The town evolved with astonishing detail. He knew which homes creaked in winter, which streets flooded during rainstorms, which shopkeeper complained constantly about tourists. The imaginary citizens aged, changed clothes, remembered previous conversations. Meanwhile, the real world faded. Elias sometimes forgot prisoners' names moments after hearing them. He stopped reacting to beatings quickly enough. Guards noticed the strange emptiness in his eyes. One prisoner later said Elias looked half asleep while awake. But inside Hallstatt, Elias felt more alive than ever. That was the trap. The imaginary world no longer existed to help him survive reality. It was replacing reality entirely. Then came the fever. Typhus spread through the camp during early spring. Barracks overflowed with dying prisoners. Bodies remained beside sleeping men until morning because there was nowhere else to put them. Elias became sick within days, high fever, hallucinations, violent trembling. And suddenly the wall between worlds collapsed completely. For nearly 3 days, Elias drifted almost entirely inside Hallstatt. The town became impossibly vivid, too vivid. He could smell lake water, hear footsteps behind him, taste food. He spent hours beside Anna near the shore while sunlight shimmered across the lake. Sometimes distant noises interrupted the illusion, coughing, screaming, gunshots. But Hallstatt swallowed them quickly. Reality entered only in fragments. At one point, another prisoner tried shaking Elias awake because guards were conducting inspections. Elias stared at him in confusion, as if seeing a stranger from another universe. "What camp?" he whispered. The prisoner later said the words chilled him more than the cold because for a moment, Elias truly did not know where he was. But the human mind cannot live divided forever. Eventually, one world begins consuming the other. And in extreme conditions, that collision can become catastrophic. One evening, Elias returned from forced labor to find several prisoners gathered silently outside the barracks. Nobody spoke. A young man had died during work detail, 17 years old, starved beyond recognition. The guards left his body near the fence for hours as punishment. Elias stared at the corpse, and suddenly something cracked inside him. Not grief, something deeper. Because he realized the dead boy had no Hallstatt, no escape, only reality, only suffering. That night, Elias walked through Hallstatt again. But the town had changed. The streets were emptier, fog covered the lake, several buildings stood abandoned. When he reached the bakery, Anna looked frightened. "You should not stay here forever," she told him. Elias froze. The sentence disturbed him deeply because Anna was not supposed to say unexpected things. She was imagined, controlled, safe. But now the imaginary world felt independent, alive. "You have to wake up," she whispered. Outside, the church bells began ringing violently, louder, faster. Then came barking dogs. Real dogs. The sounds merged together until Hallstatt itself started collapsing. And Elias finally understood the terrible truth. The imaginary world had saved him, but it was also slowly erasing him. The war ended nearly 2 years later. Elias survived, barely. American soldiers liberated the camp in 1945. Many prisoners cried. Others simply stared silently, too damaged to react. Elias stood near the fence looking at the open gates without moving. Freedom felt unreal because after years inside Hallstatt, reality itself no longer felt stable. Even after returning home, he continued visiting the imaginary town. Not intentionally. It simply appeared, during silence, during sleep, during moments of stress. He would suddenly smell bread that was not there, hear church bells no one else heard, sometimes catch himself searching crowds for Anna. Doctors later described such cases as trauma-induced dissociation. But labels felt too small for what survivors experienced, because these worlds were not fantasies in the ordinary sense. They were shelters built under psychological bombardment, emergency structures created by desperate minds. And sometimes the shelters became prisons of their own. Years later, Elias wrote about Hallstatt in a private journal. He never showed it publicly. Most entries described tiny details, weather patterns, street layouts, conversations with imaginary townspeople. But one final passage stood apart from the others. He wrote, "When pain became larger than the world, the mind built another one. Not to entertain itself, not to escape boredom, to survive. Because the human brain has limits. There comes a point where reality becomes too brutal to face directly. And when that happens, consciousness bends, fragments, hides, creates distance by any means necessary. Sometimes through memory, sometimes through numbness, and sometimes through entire imaginary civilizations constructed in darkness. The frightening part is not that the mind can invent these worlds. The frightening part is how real they become, how comforting, how seductive, how easy it becomes to remain there. Some prisoners survived because they mentally escaped. Others disappeared into those inner worlds completely. The line between survival and psychological collapse was often impossibly thin. One step further, and imagination stopped being refuge. It became replacement, a second reality stronger than the first. And maybe that is the most haunting thing extreme suffering reveals about the human mind, not its weakness, its willingness to tear reality apart in order to keep a person alive one more day, even if the person who survives is no longer entirely the same. So when we imagine prison camps, torture cells, and war imprisonment, we often picture physical suffering first, the hunger, the beatings, the cold. But somewhere inside those frozen barracks, invisible worlds also existed, silent towns, imaginary lovers, warm kitchens, peaceful lakes, entire hidden universes carried secretly inside starving human beings. Because when reality became unbearable, the mind became the final refuge and sometimes the final battlefield.